the unfulfilled promise of compensation for Black Americans after slavery. Why weren't Black Americans fully compensated after slavery? The history of Black Americans in the United States is one of immense hardship, resilience, and perseverance. For over 400 years, Black people were enslaved, forced to work without pay, and subjected to brutal oppression. Even after slavery was officially abolished in 1865, systemic racism in the form of segregation, discriminatory laws, and economic exclusion continued to block opportunities for Black Americans. Despite contributing to the country's economy, culture, and development, Black people were never fully compensated for their labor or the injustices they endured. Unlike other ethnic groups who faced injustices in America, such as Japanese Americans, Native Americans, and Jewish Holocaust survivors, all of whom received some form of reparations, Black Americans have yet to be compensated on a national level. The promise of 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War was never fulfilled, and generations of Black families were denied access to land, housing, and financial resources that helped white families accumulate wealth. Instead, racist policies such as Jim Crow laws, redlining, and voter suppression ensured that Black Americans remained economically and socially disadvantaged for over a century after slavery ended. The question of whether Black Americans should receive reparations remains a major topic of debate. While some argue that reparations are long overdue, others question how they should be implemented. This discussion is not just about the past. It's about addressing the long-lasting consequences of slavery and racial discrimination that still affect Black communities today. Broken promises, 40 acres and a mule. After the Civil War, newly freed slaves were supposed to receive land as compensation for generations of forced labor. 1865, Special Field Order No. 15, Union General William T. Sherman issued this order, which promised 400,000 acres of land along the southeastern coast to freed Black families in 40-acre plots. What happened? After President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his successor, Andrew Johnson, reversed the order and gave the land back to former Confederate plantation owners. Result: instead of being landowners and having economic independence, Black Americans were forced into sharecropping, a system that kept them in poverty and economic dependence on white landowners. Jim Crow laws and economic suppression. Even after slavery, Black Americans faced laws that restricted their economic opportunities. Jim Crow laws 1877 to 1965 enforced segregation in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. Racial labor discrimination meant Black workers were often paid less than white workers for the same jobs. Voter suppression, literacy tests, poll taxes ensured Black people had little political power to fight for compensation. Result: Black Americans remained at the bottom of the economic ladder, while white families built generational wealth. The New Deal and GI Bill, benefits denied. During the 1930s and 1940s, the US government introduced programs to help struggling Americans, but Black citizens were often left out. The New Deal, 1930s to 1940s, aimed to provide economic relief after the Great Depression, but Black Americans were largely excluded. The Social Security didn't cover most Black workers, such as farm workers and domestic laborers. Federal housing programs promoted segregation and denied Black families access to home ownership. GI Bill 1944 helped World War II veterans buy homes, go to college, and start businesses, but Black veterans faced discrimination when applying for benefits. Redlining prevented them from buying homes in white neighborhoods. Banks denied Black veterans loans that white veterans received. Result: white families gained massive wealth through home ownership, while Black families were shut out. Land theft, redlining, and wealth destruction. Even when Black Americans managed to accumulate wealth and land, they were often robbed of it through racist policies and violence. Land theft. Many Black landowners in the South were forced off their land by white supremacist violence, fraud, or legal loopholes. Black farmers lost millions of acres of land from 1910 to 1997 due to discriminatory practices. Redlining, 1930s to 1960s. The government and banks marked black neighborhoods as high risk, denying black families home loans. This blocked them from building wealth through real estate while white families bought homes and passed wealth to future generations. Race massacres and economic destruction. Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. A thriving black business district, Black Wall Street, was burned down by white mobs, killing hundreds and destroying millions in black wealth. Rosewood Massacre, 1923. A prosperous black town in Florida was wiped out by white mobs. Wilmington Coup, 1898. White supremacists violently overthrew a black-led government in North Carolina. Result: even when black Americans created wealth, it was often stolen or destroyed by racist violence. Other groups received reparations. Why not black Americans? While black Americans have never received reparations for slavery and discrimination, the US has provided compensation to other groups. Japanese Americans, interned during war, received $20,000 per survivor in 1988. Native Americans received settlements for land theft and treaty violations. Jewish Holocaust survivors, the US helped facilitate reparations from Germany. Yet, despite enduring one of the longest and most brutal forms of oppression in US history, black Americans have not received any official federal reparations. Is compensation still possible? The reparations debate. The conversation about reparations is ongoing, with some cities and states starting to explore programs. States like California have started studying reparations. However, there's strong political opposition, and no federal policy has been enacted yet. The debate is complicated, but many argue that black Americans deserve some form of economic justice, whether through direct payments, education funding, housing grants, or other means to close the racial wealth gap created by centuries of unpaid labor and systemic discrimination. It's a tough conversation, but one worth having. What do you think? Should there be reparations, and if so, what form should they take? The legacy of slavery and the ongoing fight for justice. The failure to fully compensate black Americans for slavery and racial injustice has had lasting consequences. The racial wealth gap in the United States remains stark, with white families holding significantly more wealth than black families, a direct result of centuries of economic exclusion. The effects of slavery and segregation are still visible today in disparities in home ownership, education, healthcare, and employment. Despite these injustices, black Americans have continued to fight for equality, build successful communities, and shape American history in profound ways. From the civil rights movement to present-day activism, the struggle for racial justice is ongoing. Discussions about reparations are not just about financial compensation. They are about acknowledging historical wrongs, addressing economic disparities, and creating opportunities for future generations. The conversation about reparations continues to evolve, with some states and cities exploring policies to provide compensation in various forms. However, until systemic injustices are fully addressed and meaningful reparations are implemented, black Americans will continue to push for justice. The question remains, will the United States ever take full responsibility for the lasting impact of slavery? And if so, what will justice look like? Let us know in the comment section and share this with others so they can learn too.